The courtroom doors swung open, and I stepped inside with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're worth. The mahogany panels gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the familiar scent of old wood and paper filled my lungs. I had stood in countless courtrooms before, but never as the defendant. That distinction alone made this moment deliciously ironic. My heels clicked against the polished floor as I made my way down the aisle. I could feel their eyes on me before I even looked. Diane Morrison sat in the second row, her blonde hair teased into an elaborate updo that probably cost more than my monthly dry cleaning bill. She wore a cream-colored suit that screamed expensive but whispered gaudy. Scott Morrison slouched beside her, scrolling through his phone with the kind of bored indifference I had known my entire life. When Diane caught sight of me, her lips curled into something between a sneer and a smirk. Scott didn't even bother to look up. They had no idea who I was. Not really, and honestly, that was the best part. Judge Marcus Brennan sat at the bench, reviewing documents with the focused intensity of a man who had spent decades weighing the fates of others. His silver hair caught the light as he turned a page, and then he froze. His eyes moved from the file to my face, then back again, widening with recognition. "Wait a moment," he said, slowly setting down his pen with a deliberate tap that echoed through the silent courtroom. "These allegations are against you, Haley Morrison." I allowed myself a cold smile, letting my gaze drift lazily across my parents' faces before returning to the judge. "Yes, Your Honor." My parents didn't know I was a senior prosecutor. They didn't know I had graduated top of my class from Yale Law. They didn't know I had put away dozens of white-collar criminals and won commendations from the Attorney General. They knew nothing about the woman I had become because they had never bothered to ask. Judge Brennan leaned back in his chair, and I caught the flicker of something in his expression. Recognition, yes, but also understanding. For the record, I served as law clerk to Judge William Parker 30 years ago. Does either party object to my presiding over this case? Richard Palmer, Diane's attorney, whispered urgently with his clients. Diane's face had gone pale, her carefully applied makeup suddenly looking garish against her skin. Scott finally looked up from his phone, confusion creasing his forehead. Palmer straightened his tie and announced, "No objection, Your Honor." I watched them make their fatal mistake and thought to myself, this is going to be easier than I imagined. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how I ended up here, you need to know where it all began. 3 months earlier, I stood in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, delivering my grandfather's eulogy. The Gothic arches soared above us, and hundreds of faces stared up at me from the pews. Judges, lawyers, politicians, professors, they had all come to pay their respects to Judge William Parker, a titan of American jurisprudence, who had served on the Supreme Court of New York for 23 years. My voice didn't waver as I spoke. I had learned early that tears were a private matter, something to be hidden away like old photographs. I talked about his brilliance, his integrity, his unwavering commitment to justice, but mostly I talked about his love. My grandfather taught me that the law must be blind, but those who interpret it must see everything I said, gripping the edges of the podium. He taught me that justice isn't about winning or losing. It's about truth. And he taught me that the greatest gift you can give someone is your presence, your time, your unwavering support when the world tries to break them. In the back row, Diane and Scott slipped in 20 minutes late. Diane checked her phone repeatedly, not even pretending to pay attention. Scott yawned so widely I could see his molars from where I stood. They left before the service ended, disappearing through the heavy wooden doors without a word of condolence, without a touch on my shoulder, without even acknowledging that I existed. I watched them go, and something inside me crystallized into diamond-hard resolve. They had done this my entire life, but this time it would cost them everything. The memories came in fragments, sharp-edged and bitter. I was 3 months old when Diane and Scott dropped me off at my grandparents' house. Diane was 18, fresh out of high school, with dreams of modeling and a hockey player boyfriend who had just signed with a minor league team. She wore designer jeans and carried me in a car seat like I was luggage she couldn't wait to check. "Just for a little while," she had said, according to my grandmother. "Until we get settled." That little while stretched into 32 years. My earliest memory is of sitting alone on a swing set, watching other children run to their parents. I was maybe 4 years old, small for my age, with wild, dark curls that my grandmother braided every morning. I pumped my legs, trying to swing high enough to fly away, while around me, families laughed and played. My grandmother sat on a nearby bench, smiling encouragement, but I could see the sadness in her eyes. Even then, I understood that something was missing, though I couldn't name what it was. The birthday cards came sporadically, always late, always generic, to a special granddaughter with Diane's looping signature and nothing else. No mention of inside jokes we didn't have. No reference to memories we hadn't made. Just printed sentiments that meant less than nothing. I was 7 when I performed my first solo in the school Christmas concert. I had practiced Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer for weeks, learning to project my voice to the back of the auditorium. I wore a red velvet dress that my grandmother had sewn by hand, and I felt like a princess as I stood on that stage under the bright lights. Before I began to sing, I scanned the audience, searching for 2 faces I had only seen in photographs. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked row by row, hope and dread warring in my chest. My grandparents sat in the front, my grandfather in his customary 3-piece suit, my grandmother dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. But Diane and Scott weren't there. I sang anyway. My voice only cracked once on the word games, and I recovered quickly. The audience applauded. My grandparents stood and cheered. But all I could think about was the 2 empty seats that should have been filled. Afterward, my grandfather knelt down to my level and pulled me into a hug. "You were magnificent, Haley Bear," he said, using the nickname he had given me as a baby. "Your grandmother and I are so proud of you." That night, I learned that there are lies sweeter than truth, and that sometimes love means protecting a child from reality. My grandparents told me Diane and Scott had wanted to come but had important work commitments. I nodded and smiled, but my heart knew the truth. It always had. The moments that defined my childhood were the ones they missed. My first day of school, when I clung to my grandmother's hand and cried because I didn't want her to leave. My 8th birthday party, where I blew out candles on a homemade cake and wished for parents who cared. My 6th grade science fair, where my project on lunar phases won first place, and my grandfather took me out for ice cream to celebrate. But there were visits, though. They were rare and painful. Diane would sweep in like a perfumed hurricane, bringing expensive gifts that showed she knew nothing about me. Designer clothes in the wrong size. Makeup kits when I was 10 and only interested in books. A pink bicycle when I had specifically asked for a telescope. "Don't you love it?" she would coo, her voice high and artificial. "It's from Paris. Or was it Milan? I can never remember." I learned to smile and say thank you because that's what good girls did. But inside, I was cataloging every dismissal, every broken promise, every moment that proved I was nothing more than an obligation she had successfully outsourced. Scott was worse because at least Diane pretended. He would stay in the car honking the horn after 5 minutes, irritated that he had to waste his time on a child he had never wanted. On the rare occasions he came inside, he would sit on the couch with his arms crossed, checking his watch every 30 seconds. "Can we hurry this up?" he would say to Diane. "The game starts in an hour." I was 12 when I overheard the conversation that changed everything. I had come downstairs for a glass of water and heard raised voices from my grandfather's study. The door was slightly ajar, and I recognized my grandfather's deep baritone and Scott's whining tenor. "One day she's going to grow up," my grandfather said, his voice heavy with controlled anger. "She's going to remember who was there for her. You still have time to change what she remembers." Scott laughed a sharp, ugly sound. "Spare me the lecture, Your Honor. Diane and I are doing fine. Haley's being taken care of. That's what matters." Taken care of. My grandfather's voice rose, and I had never heard him sound so furious. "Is that what you think parenting is? Writing checks? She needs more than your money, Scott. She needs you." "Look, I'm not going to be guilted about this," Scott shot back. "Diane and I have our own lives. We didn't ask for this responsibility. You and Helen wanted to take her, so you took her. Don't pretend we forced you." "No one forced us," my grandfather said quietly. "But that doesn't excuse what you've done. Or rather, what you haven't done. You're going to regret this, Scott. One day, you're going to wake up and realize what you threw away, and by then it will be too late." Scott slammed out of the house moments later, tires screeching as he peeled out of the driveway. I crept back upstairs and lay in bed staring at the ceiling until dawn. That night, I stopped waiting for them to love me. I stopped hoping they would change. I stopped being the little girl who sang to empty seats. Instead, I became something else. Someone else. My grandfather noticed the shift immediately. A few days later, he knocked on my bedroom door and found me reading a book on constitutional law that I had pulled from his library. "That's advanced reading for a 12-year-old, he observed, settling into the chair by my desk. "I want to understand what you do," I said, not looking up from the page. "I want to be like you." He was quiet for a long moment, then he said, "Why?" I finally met his eyes. "Because you're here. You've always been here, and I want to make you proud." My grandfather's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them away. Haley, you already make me proud every single day just by being you. But if you want to learn about the law, I'll teach you. Not because I need you to prove anything, but because knowledge is power, and power used correctly can change the world. That conversation marked the beginning of my real education. Every evening after dinner, I would sit in my grandfather's study while he walked me through famous cases, explained legal principles, and taught me to think like a judge. He never condescended to me, never simplified things because I was young. He treated me like an equal, a colleague in training. The law is a weapon, Haley, he told me when I was 14. It can be used to oppress or to liberate. It can destroy lives or save them. The question is always, what kind of lawyer will you be? I want to be the kind who fights for people who can't fight for themselves, I said without hesitation. He smiled. Then you're already on the right path. My grandmother taught me different lessons. She showed me that strength could be gentle, that love could be shown through small acts repeated over time. She taught me to bake, and we spent countless Saturday mornings in the kitchen floor, dusting our clothes as we kneaded bread and rolled out pie crusts. Cooking is chemistry, darling, she would say, measuring ingredients with practiced precision. But it's also love made tangible. When you feed someone, you're saying, I see you, I value you, I want you to be nourished. She taught me to garden, and we planted tulips every fall, watching them bloom in the spring like small miracles. She taught me to sew, to paint, to play piano. But most importantly, she taught me that I was worthy of love, not because of what I did, but because of who I was. When I was 18, my grandmother died suddenly of a stroke. I found her in the garden, collapsed among the tulips we had planted together the previous autumn. She died before the ambulance arrived, her hand going cold in mine as I knelt beside her in the dirt. Diane and Scott came to the funeral. They stood in the back left immediately afterward and never called to check on me or my grandfather. Not once. The grief nearly broke us both. My grandfather aged 10 years overnight, his shoulders bowing under the weight of losing his life partner. I threw myself into my studies with manic intensity, using schoolwork as armor against the crushing sadness. But something shifted in our relationship. The tragedy forged us into an unbreakable unit of two. We became each other's family in the truest sense, supporting each other through the darkness. She loved you more than anything, my grandfather told me one night as we sat in his study, both of us unable to sleep. When Diane first brought you to us, Helen took one look at you and fell completely in love. She used to say you were her second chance, her opportunity to do everything right. I wish I could have told her, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I wish I could have thanked her for everything. She knew, Haley Bear, he said gently. She always knew. I graduated from high school as valedictorian. My grandfather sat in the front row, beaming with pride, holding an empty seat beside him for my grandmother. Diane and Scott didn't come. They sent a card 3 weeks later with a $50 bill inside. I went to Yale, then Yale Law School, graduating at the top of my class both times. My grandfather attended every ceremony, every award presentation, every milestone. He was there when I passed the bar exam on my first try. He was there when I started, as an assistant district attorney in Manhattan. He was there when I won my first case, my first conviction, my first commendation. Diane and Scott were never there. Not once in 14 years of higher education and professional development. During my second year as a prosecutor, I ran into an old family friend who knew Diane and Scott socially. She gushed about how proud they must be of me, how they must brag about their daughter, the prosecutor. Oh, Diane doesn't really talk about Haley, the woman said, confusion crossing her face. To be honest, I didn't even know she had a daughter until you mentioned it. She always talks about her boutique and her book club. I smiled and changed the subject, but the conversation confirmed what I had always known. To them, I didn't exist. I was an inconvenient fact they had successfully erased from their narrative. My grandfather was 87 when he died, sharp-minded and vital until the very end. He had a heart attack in his sleep, passing peacefully in the bed he had shared with my grandmother for 40 years. The doctors said it was sudden and painless, that he likely felt nothing. I felt everything. The funeral was enormous, befitting a man of his stature. Former governors spoke. Supreme Court justices delivered remarks. Law professors eulogized him as one of the great legal minds of his generation. I stood at the podium and told the truth. Not the polished, sanitized version, but the real truth about a man who had saved me when no one else would. William Parker was my grandfather by blood, I said, my voice ringing through the cathedral. But he was my father in every way that mattered. When I was 3 months old, my biological parents decided they weren't ready for the responsibility of raising a child. My grandfather didn't hesitate. He and my grandmother took me in not temporarily but forever. They raised me, loved me, supported me, and made me who I am today. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the assembled crowd. My grandfather taught me that family isn't defined by biology. It's defined by presence, by showing up, by being there for the small moments and the big ones, for the triumphs and the failures, for the ordinary Tuesday dinners and the extraordinary achievements. He taught me that love is a verb, not a feeling. It's something you do every single day, even when it's hard. In the back row, Diane dabbed at her eyes with a tissue while scrolling through her phone. Scott yawned. They left early, as always. 2 weeks after the funeral, I sat in the office of Margaret Chen, my grandfather's estate attorney. The office was done in soothing neutrals with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. I had expected this meeting to be brief and painful, a formality before I moved on with my life. I was not prepared for what came next. Margaret, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and kind eyes, opened a leather portfolio and began to read. The last will and testament of William Arthur Parker, dated March 15th, 2 years ago. She read through the standard legal language and I half listened, lost in memories. Then she reached the substantive provisions. I leave my entire estate, including but not limited to my home at 1247 Park Avenue, my investment portfolio currently valued at approximately $2 million, my savings accounts, and the proceeds of my life insurance policy, totaling $1 million to my granddaughter Haley Catherine Morrison, who has been my daughter in every way except biology. I froze. The total value was over $3 million. To my daughter, Diane Elizabeth Morrison, and her husband, Scott James Morrison, I leave nothing. This is not an oversight or a mistake. It is a deliberate choice based on their choices. For 32 years, they abdicated their parental responsibilities and chose not to be present in Haley's life. They chose convenience over commitment, selfishness over sacrifice, and indifference over love. This is the consequence of their choices. Margaret looked up from the document, watching my reaction. I sat perfectly still, my mind racing. "There's more," she said gently. "Your grandfather wrote you a letter. He asked that I read it aloud in the presence of your biological parents, should they choose to contest the will. Given what I know about them, he predicted they would." She pulled out a sealed envelope and opened it with a letter opener. My grandfather's familiar handwriting covered the page, and Margaret's voice softened as she read. "My dearest Haley, if you are hearing this letter, it means I am gone, and it means Diane and Scott have shown their true colors one final time by attempting to claim what they have no right to. I am not surprised. Disappointed but not surprised." Margaret paused to take a breath, then continued. "You deserve everything. I am leaving you not because of blood but because of presence, because you sat with me through Helen's death and your own grief. Because you called me every Sunday even when you were drowning in law school assignments. Because you chose to spend your free time with an old man when you could have been living your life. Because you loved me truly and completely, asking for nothing in return." Tears burned in my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. "Diane and Scott will tell you they loved you. They will say circumstances prevented them from being more present. They will paint themselves as victims of my manipulation. Do not believe them. They had every opportunity to be your parents. They chose not to take it. That choice has consequences." Margaret set down the first page and picked up the second. "Use this inheritance wisely, my darling girl. Not just the money, but the lessons I tried to teach you. Be the judge I know you can be. Fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. Make the law a tool of justice, not oppression. And most importantly, remember that you are worthy of love not because of what you achieve, but because of who you are. Your grandmother and I loved you with our whole hearts. We always will. Love, Grandpa." By the time Margaret finished reading, I was gripping the arms of my chair so hard my knuckles had gone white. She set down the letter and pulled out another envelope. "Your grandfather was a brilliant strategist," she said with a slight smile. "He knew Diane and Scott would contest the will, so he prepared evidence." She spread documents across her desk. Bank statements showing monthly transfers of $5,000 to Diane's account for 20 years. Emails from Scott asking for loans to fund failing business ventures. Text messages from Diane canceling visits at the last minute. A spreadsheet my grandfather had meticulously maintained, tracking every interaction, every broken promise, every abandoned responsibility. He documented everything Margaret said. He wanted you to have proof, not just for legal purposes, but for your own peace of mind. He wanted you to know that he saw the truth, and he wanted to protect you from their lies. I looked at the mountain of evidence, the irrefutable documentation of 3 decades of neglect, and I felt something cold and sharp crystallize in my chest. Not anger exactly, something purer. something that felt almost like justice. "They're going to fight this," I said quietly. Margaret nodded. "I'm certain they will. Your grandfather estimated they would file suit within 2 weeks of his death. He was rarely wrong about human nature." "Good," I said, meeting her eyes. "Let them fight. Let them stand up in court and explain why they think they deserve his money. I'll be waiting." They filed the lawsuit 9 days later. The allegations were exactly what my grandfather had predicted: undue influence, lack of mental capacity manipulation by a scheming granddaughter who had isolated him from his true family. Richard Palmer, Diane's attorney, crafted a narrative of victimhood so absurd it would have been funny if it weren't so insulting. According to the complaint, I had systematically poisoned my grandfather against his loving daughter and son-in-law. I had manipulated an elderly man in his declining mental health, taking advantage of his grief over my grandmother's death. I had controlled his finances, his social interactions, and his medical care, all in service of securing an inheritance I didn't deserve. It was fiction. Elaborate, detailed fiction. I was in the middle of depositions for a securities fraud case when my assistant brought me the lawsuit. I read through it once, slowly making notes in the margins. Then I picked up my phone and called Thomas Reeves, one of the best civil litigators in New York. "I need representation in a will contest," I told him. "And Thomas, I need to win. Not just win. I need to destroy them." "Tell me everything," he said. I did. Which brings us back to the courtroom 3 months after my grandfather's death, where Judge Marcus Brennan presided over the case that would determine who truly deserved William Parker's legacy. Richard Palmer stood to deliver his opening statement. He was a man in his 50s with a tendency toward theatrical gestures and emotional manipulation. He had built a career on making juries cry, and he approached this bench trial with the same strategy. "Your Honor," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "this case is about a family torn apart by manipulation and greed. Diane Morrison is a loving daughter who tried desperately to maintain a relationship with her father, only to be systematically excluded by a granddaughter who saw dollar signs instead of family bonds." I kept my face neutral, but inside I was cataloging every lie for future dismantling. Palmer continued weaving a tale of Diane's supposed devotion, her alleged attempts to visit that were rebuffed, her heartbreak at being separated from her father. He painted me as calculating and cold, a woman who had orchestrated an elderly man's isolation for financial gain. "Haley Morrison is a prosecutor," Palmer said, gesturing toward me. "She knows how to manipulate evidence, how to build a case, how to make innocent people look guilty. She used those skills on her own grandfather, turning him against his daughter so she could inherit his fortune." When he finally sat down, I caught Diane wiping away tears. Scott looked bored, but at least he was paying attention now. Thomas stood for our opening statement. He was everything Palmer wasn't: calm, precise, focused on facts rather than emotions. "Your Honor, this case is actually quite simple," Thomas said. "Judge William Parker was a brilliant legal mind who served this state with distinction for over 4 decades. He was mentally sharp until the day he died. He drafted a clear, unambiguous will that reflected his true intentions. Those intentions were based on 32 years of observable behavior from both his granddaughter and his daughter." Thomas laid out our case with surgical precision: the documented evidence of my grandfather's mental capacity, the testimony we would present from colleagues and friends, the financial records showing exactly where Diane and Scott had been receiving substantial support while providing none in return. At the end of this trial, Thomas concluded the evidence will show that Judge Parker's will should be upheld exactly as written. Not because Haley Morrison manipulated him, but because she earned his love and trust through 3 decades of unwavering presence and support. That's not manipulation. That's family. The first witness Palmer called was Diane. She took the stand wearing a demure navy dress, her makeup subtle, her demeanor carefully crafted to appear sympathetic. She had practiced this performance, I realized, probably in front of a mirror. Under Palmer's gentle questioning, Diane painted herself as the victim of circumstances beyond her control. She claimed my grandparents had essentially kidnapped me, making her feel unwelcome in her own father's home. She spoke of longing to be more involved in my life, but being prevented by my grandmother's jealousy and my grandfather's controlling nature. It was masterful fiction. Then Thomas stood for cross-examination, and the performance crumbled. "Miss Morrison," Thomas began, his tone conversational, "you testified that you wanted to be more involved in Haley's life. Let's discuss what involvement meant to you." He pulled out a chart, displaying it on a screen visible to the entire courtroom. "This is a calendar of your visits to your father's home over the 32 years Haley lived there." Can you tell the court how many times you visited in Haley's first 5 years of life? Diane shifted uncomfortably. I don't remember exactly. According to your father's records, it was 11 times. 11 visits in 5 years. That's approximately twice per year. Does that sound accurate? He kept records. Diane's voice went sharp, then she caught herself. I mean, yes, that sounds possible. Thomas smiled. Oh, he kept meticulous records. He was a judge after all. Now let's talk about the financial support he provided you. Over the course of 32 years, your father gave you approximately $800,000. Correct. It was for living expenses, Diane said defensively. Living expenses, Thomas repeated. You and your husband, who has earned an average of $200,000 per year for the last 20 years, needed $800,000 in supplemental income. Silence. Let me rephrase, Thomas said. What did you use that money for, Miss Morrison? Normal things. Household costs. Clothing. Thomas pulled out more documents. According to bank records, subpoenaed for this case, significant portions of that money went to fund luxury vacations, designer purchases, and country club memberships. Would you call those normal household costs? I don't see how that's relevant, Palmer objected. Judge Brennan looked at Palmer over his reading glasses. It speaks to the relationship between the parties. Overruled. Miss Morrison, please answer the question. Diane's composure was cracking. I used the money for my family. Your family, Thomas said softly. Tell me, Miss Morrison, did your family include Haley? Of course it did. Then why didn't you attend her high school graduation? I had a conflict. Or her college graduation. I don't remember. Or her law school graduation. Diane's eyes filled with tears. Real ones this time, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage and humiliation. Thomas projected a photograph on the screen. It showed me in cap and gown flanked by my grandparents. My grandmother's eyes were shining with pride. My grandfather was beaming. The front row seats beside them were empty. This is Haley's law school graduation from Yale, Thomas said. One of the most prestigious institutions in the country. Your daughter graduated with highest honors. Where were you that day, Miss Morrison? I don't recall. Thomas pulled out another document. According to your credit card statements, you were at a spa in Connecticut. You charged $300 for a massage and facial. You were 45 minutes away and you chose a spa day over your daughter's graduation. The courtroom was utterly silent. Thomas continued his methodical destruction. He showed that Diane had missed every important event in my life. Every school performance, every award ceremony, every milestone. He demonstrated that her visits had virtually ceased after my grandfather stopped increasing her monthly allowance. He proved that she had called her father less than once per month in the final 10 years of his life. In fact, Thomas said, consulting his notes, your father meticulously tracked communication with you. In the last decade of his life, you initiated contact with him 37 times. Do you know how many times Haley contacted him in that same period? Diane shook her head, lips pressed into a thin line. 1,162 times. She called him every Sunday without fail for 10 years. She visited him weekly. She took him to doctor's appointments when his health declined. She sat with him on the anniversary of your mother's death every single year. She was present, Miss Morrison. Where were you? You're twisting everything, Diane burst out. I loved my father. Did you? Thomas's voice was quiet but devastating. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you loved his money. Not him, not your daughter, just his money. Palmer objected strenuously, but the damage was done. When Diane stepped down from the stand, her carefully constructed image had been obliterated. She wasn't a grieving daughter denied her inheritance. She was a woman who had spent 32 years collecting checks and providing nothing in return. Scott was even worse. He took the stand with visible reluctance, his body language screaming that he would rather be anywhere else. Under Palmer's questioning, he offered tepid support for Diane's version of events, but his heart wasn't in it. He claimed he had tried to build a relationship with me, but had been prevented by my grandparents' interference. Thomas's cross-examination was brutal in its simplicity. Mr. Morrison, do you remember Haley's birthday? Scott blinked. What? Her birthday. Month and day. Do you know it? February. Or maybe March. August 16th, Thomas said coldly. Your daughter was born on August 16th and you don't even know the month. Let's try something easier. What was Haley's major in college? Liberal arts, political science and history. Double major. She wrote her senior thesis on judicial activism in the Warren Court. Your father-in-law was so proud he kept a framed copy in his study. Did you ever read it? I don't remember. Did you ever visit that study, Mr. Morrison? Scott's jaw clenched. Occasionally. Thomas pulled out more photographs. Images of me at various ages, kindergarten, middle school, high school, college. In every single one, my grandparents were present. Scott was in none of them. Your daughter had a major piano recital when she was 13, Thomas said. She performed Beethoven's Sonata Pathétique. It's considered one of the more challenging pieces for a young pianist. Do you remember attending Anitas? It was a long time ago. You didn't attend. According to Judge Parker's calendar, you were at a hockey game. Your beer league had playoffs that weekend and you chose that over your daughter's achievement. Thomas let that sink in, then continued. In fact, Mr. Morrison, let's be honest about your relationship with Haley. You saw her as an inconvenience, didn't you? A mistake that your in-laws were kind enough to handle so you didn't have to. That's not true. Then why did you repeatedly ask Judge Parker for money despite earning a substantial income yourself? I had business ventures that needed capital. Ventures that failed, Thomas said. Every single one. The sports memorabilia shop that closed after 8 months, the craft beer distributorship that went bankrupt, the consulting firm that never had a single client, and every time one of your ideas failed, you went back to Judge Parker for more money. How much did he give you over the years? Scott shifted in his seat. I don't know exactly. $340,000, Thomas said. That's how much Judge Parker gave you to fund your failed businesses. Did you ever pay any of it back? We had an understanding. Did you? Or did you simply exploit a man's love for his daughter by asking for money you knew he couldn't refuse without cutting off contact with her entirely? Palmer was on his feet objecting, but Judge Brennan waved him down. The truth was too obvious to hide behind legal technicalities. Scott left the stand looking defeated, and I allowed myself a small smile. They were losing and they knew it. Palmer's final witness was Dr. Raymond Hughes, a psychiatrist who had never met my grandfather, but was prepared to testify about his supposed mental decline based on medical records. It was a desperate move, and Thomas dismantled it with surgical precision. Dr. Hughes, Thomas began, you've never examined Judge Parker, is that correct? I reviewed his medical records extensively. Medical records that show what exactly normal cognitive function for a man in his 80s. Excellent memory. No diagnosis of dementia, Alzheimer's, or any other cognitive impairment. Dr. Hughes shifted uncomfortably. There were notes about depression. Notes about depression, Thomas repeated. Can you point to where in the medical records there is a formal diagnosis of clinical depression? Well, it's implied by the symptoms. Implied. So you're diagnosing a deceased patient you never met with a condition that isn't documented in his medical records and using that imaginary diagnosis to question his mental capacity. I'm offering a professional opinion based on the available information. An opinion that happens to support whoever is paying you, Thomas said. No further questions. Then it was our turn. Thomas called a parade of witnesses who had known my grandfather intimately. Judge David Thompson, who had worked alongside him for 30 years, testified about my grandfather's brilliant mind and his unwavering mental clarity until his death. Several attorneys spoke about cases my grandfather had decided in his final year, demonstrating his sharp analytical skills. Margaret Chen described his meticulous preparation of the will and his clear articulation of his reasoning. Every witness painted the same picture. William Parker had been fully competent, completely aware of his decisions, and absolutely certain about what he wanted. Then Thomas called me to the stand. I walked to the witness box with my head high, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth, as if I would do anything else. Thomas's direct examination was straightforward. He asked me to describe my relationship with my grandfather, and I told the truth. Not the sanitized version, but the real, complicated, beautiful truth. My grandfather saved me, I said simply. When I was 3 months old, my biological parents decided they weren't ready to raise a child. My grandparents didn't just take me in temporarily. They raised me as their own daughter. They attended every school event, every recital, every game. They helped with homework, drove me to activities, listened to my problems. They loved me unconditionally. I looked directly at Diane as I spoke. She had the grace to look away. My grandfather taught me everything important I know. How to think critically, how to argue a case, how to see through lies to the truth underneath. He taught me that justice requires courage, that standing up for what's right is more important than being liked. He taught me that family is defined by presence, not biology. Thomas let my words hang in the air. Then he asked, "Did you manipulate your grandfather into leaving you his estate?" "No," I said firmly. "I loved him. I spent time with him because I wanted to, not because I expected anything in return. I called him every Sunday because hearing his voice made me happy. I visited him because I cherished every moment we had together. If he had left me nothing, I would have grieved his loss exactly the same way. The inheritance doesn't change what we had, it just reflects it." Then Palmer stood for cross-examination, and I could see the calculation in his eyes. He knew I was a prosecutor, that I was trained to handle hostile questioning, but he had to try. "Miss Morrison," he began, "you've painted yourself as a devoted granddaughter. But isn't it true that you benefited enormously from your grandfather's connections in the legal field?" "I benefited from his mentorship," I said, "just as thousands of other law students and young lawyers did. He was generous with his knowledge and his time." "But you had special access," Palmer pressed. "You lived with him. You had his undivided attention." "Yes," I agreed. "I did. Because I was there. Every Sunday, every holiday, every Tuesday when he wanted company for dinner. That wasn't manipulation. That was family." Palmer tried another angle. "You graduated from Yale, one of the most expensive schools in the country. Your grandfather paid for that education, didn't he?" "He did. So you benefited financially from your relationship with him long before this inheritance." I leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Palmer, my grandfather offered to pay for my education because he was proud of me and wanted to support my dreams. He could have offered the same to Diane at any point in the previous 30 years. She chose not to pursue education. She chose to pursue his wallet instead. There's a difference between accepting support offered freely and demanding money, while providing nothing in return." Palmer's face flushed. "You're very articulate, Miss Morrison, very skilled at making yourself look good." "I'm a prosecutor," I said calmly. "I'm trained to present facts clearly. Would you like me to present some facts about your clients? I have 32 years' worth." Judge Brennan's lips twitched, almost smiling. "Just answer the questions, Miss Morrison." Palmer tried to paint me as calculating, as someone who had isolated my grandfather from his daughter. But every question he asked gave me an opportunity to expose the truth. When he suggested I had prevented Diane from visiting, I pointed out that she had my grandfather's phone number, his address, and unlimited resources. When he implied I had controlled my grandfather's finances, I noted that he had maintained his own accounts and made his own decisions until the day he died. When he accused me of exploiting an elderly man's loneliness, I looked him dead in the eye and said something I had been waiting years to say. "Mr. Palmer, I spent my entire childhood watching your clients choose everything else over me. Their careers, their social lives, their convenience. I learned early that I was not a priority to them. So when I was old enough to choose, I chose my grandparents. I chose the people who had always chosen me. That's not exploitation. That's recognition. I recognized who truly loved me, and I loved them back. If that makes me calculating, then I'm guilty. But I'm not guilty of manipulating anyone. I'm guilty of knowing my own worth." The courtroom was silent. Even Palmer seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Thomas finished by displaying a montage of photographs on the screen. Me and my grandparents at my kindergarten graduation, at my 8th grade awards ceremony, at my high school prom, my grandmother fixing my corsage while my grandfather took pictures, at my college graduation, both of them beaming. At my law school graduation, just my grandfather, grief still evident in his eyes from my grandmother's loss, but pride shining through. "Notice who's missing," Thomas said quietly. "Not because they were excluded, but because they chose not to be there." Diane was sobbing openly now. Scott sat with his arms crossed, face red with anger and shame. I stepped down from the witness stand and returned to my seat. I had told my truth. Now it was up to Judge Brennan to decide what that truth was worth. The closing arguments were anticlimactic after everything that had come before. Palmer tried valiantly to resurrect his narrative of manipulation and undue influence, but the evidence had gutted his case. Thomas simply recapped the facts: my grandfather's mental capacity, his clear intent, the documented pattern of neglect from Diane and Scott, and the equally documented pattern of devotion from me. "Your Honor," Thomas concluded, "Judge Parker's will should stand because it reflects his true wishes. Those wishes were based on 32 years of observable behavior. He left his estate to the person who had been his true daughter, not in biology, but in every way that matters." Judge Brennan took a brief recess to review his notes. When he returned, his expression was grave. "I have considered all the evidence presented," he began, "and I find the following. First, there is absolutely no credible evidence that Judge William Parker lacked mental capacity at the time he executed his will. Every witness who knew him testified to his clarity of mind. His actions in the final years of his life demonstrate sound judgment and rational decision-making. Diane gripped Scott's hand, hope flickering in her eyes. Second, Judge Brennan continued, there is no evidence of undue influence. Miss Haley Morrison did not isolate Judge Parker from his daughter. The evidence shows that Diane Morrison chose to minimize contact with her father over a period of decades. She cannot now claim that she was prevented from having a relationship she never attempted to build. The hope in Diane's eyes was fading. Third, Judge Parker's will clearly reflects his true intentions. He articulated his reasoning both in the will itself and in the letter he left for Miss Morrison. His decisions were based on the objective reality of who had been present in his life and who had not. Judge Brennan looked directly at Diane and Scott. The court finds that the will is valid and should be upheld as written. The allegations of undue influence and lack of mental capacity are without merit and are hereby dismissed. Diane let out a wail. Scott cursed under his breath. But Judge Brennan wasn't finished. Furthermore, he said, his voice taking on a harder edge, the court finds that this lawsuit was frivolous and brought in bad faith. The plaintiffs had to have known their claims were without merit, yet they proceeded anyway, forcing Miss Morrison to expend significant resources defending her grandfather's clearly stated wishes. Therefore, the plaintiffs are ordered to pay Miss Morrison's attorney's fees in full. This court will not reward bad faith litigation. He brought his gavel down with a sharp crack. This case is closed. I sat perfectly still, letting the victory wash over me. It wasn't joy I felt exactly. It was something cleaner. Something that felt like vindication. Thomas leaned over and shook my hand. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "Your grandfather would be proud." "He was already proud," I said. "That's why we're here." Outside the courtroom, Diane rushed toward me, her face streaked with mascara and tears. She looked older than her 50 years, the weight of her choices finally visible in the lines around her mouth and eyes. "Haley, please," she gasped, reaching for my arm. "Can't we talk about this?" I stepped back, keeping my distance. "There's nothing to talk about, Diane." "I'm your mother," she said desperately. The word hit me like a slap, but I didn't flinch. I had been preparing for this moment for 3 decades. "No," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the courthouse lobby. People were watching and I didn't care. "You're the woman who gave birth to me. My mother was Helen Parker. My father was William Parker. They earned those titles by being there for me every single day of my life. You're just Diane, a woman who took my grandfather's money for 30 years and now wants more." Diane made a sound like a wounded animal. Scott pulled her back, his face mottled with rage. "You ungrateful little," he started. "Careful," I interrupted, my prosecutor's voice cutting through his anger. "You're in a courthouse and I know every judge in this building. I suggest you think very carefully about what you say next." Scott's mouth snapped shut. I looked at both of them, these strangers who shared my DNA but nothing else. "Don't contact me again," I said. "Don't call, don't email, don't send letters or show up at my office. Don't try to insert yourselves into my life now that there's nothing left to take. We're done. We were done when I was 3 months old. This is just the official declaration." I turned and walked away, my heels clicking on the marble floor. I didn't look back, not once. Judge Thompson was waiting by the elevator. He had sat through every day of the trial, a silent show of support. When he saw me, he smiled and placed a hand on my shoulder. "William would have been so proud of you today," he said. "I hope so," I replied, my voice suddenly thick with emotion. "I know so," he said firmly. "You honored him. You honored his wishes. You honored the truth. That's all he ever wanted." The elevator doors opened and we rode down in companionable silence. When we reached the ground floor, Judge Thompson handed me a business card. "When you're ready to take the next step in your career," he said, "call me. The bench needs people like you. People who understand what justice really means." I tucked the card into my pocket and thanked him. But I already knew what my next step would be. My grandfather had shown me the path. Now I just had to follow it. That evening, I drove to Woodlawn Cemetery, where my grandparents were buried side by side. The tulips I had planted on my grandmother's grave had bloomed, creating a carpet of red and yellow. I sat on the grass between their headstones and let myself cry for the first time since the trial began. "We won, Grandpa," I whispered. "They tried to rewrite history, tried to claim they deserved what you built, but the truth came out. Your wishes will be honored." The wind rustled through the trees and I imagined it was his response. "I'm going to make you proud," I promised. I'm going to use everything you gave me, everything you taught me to make a difference, not just for me, but for people who need someone to fight for them. People like I was ignored, dismissed, treated as less than they are. I'm going to be their voice. I stayed there until the sun set, talking to them, laughing at memories, crying at loss. When I finally left, I felt lighter. The weight of obligation to Diane and Scott was gone. The weight of the lawsuit was gone. All that remained was purpose. 3 months after the trial ended, I found a package waiting at my apartment. It was from Mrs. Henderson, an elderly neighbor of my grandfather's. Inside was a thick envelope containing dozens of letters, all in my grandfather's handwriting, all addressed to Diane, but never sent. I sat on my couch and read them one by one, watching my grandfather's relationship with his daughter unfold in reverse. The early letters were angry, demanding that she step up and be a parent. The middle ones were pleading, begging her to see what she was missing. The later ones were sad and resigned, accepting that she would never change. But one letter stood out, written about 6 months before he died. Dear Diane, I have tried for 32 years to understand your choices. I have tried to believe that you would wake up one day and realize what you were throwing away. I'm finally accepting that day will never come. You gave me Haley, and she saved my life after your mother died. She gave me purpose and joy when I thought I had none left. I know you will contest my will. I know you will claim I was manipulated or mentally incompetent. I have prepared for this. Not because I want to hurt you, but because I want to protect Haley from your final attempt to exploit what I built. She deserves everything I'm giving her, not because of blood, but because of love. I hope someday you understand the difference. Love, Dad. I folded the letter carefully and added it to the box of keepsakes I had inherited. My grandfather had seen it all coming. He had prepared for every eventuality. He had protected me even in death. That knowledge was worth more than the inheritance. Over the next few years, I threw myself into my career with renewed intensity. I took on the cases other prosecutors avoided, the ones that required patience and strategy, and absolute commitment to truth. I won convictions against corporate executives who had defrauded investors, against domestic abusers, who had terrorized their families, against corrupt officials who had betrayed the public trust. Judge Thompson kept in touch, mentoring me just as my grandfather had. When a judicial vacancy opened up, he called me personally. You're young for a judgeship, he said, but you're ready, more than ready. Let me recommend you. I was 33 years old when I was appointed to the bench. The confirmation hearing was intense, with senators questioning my experience and my temperament. One senator, clearly briefed by someone, asked about the lawsuit with my parents. Some people might question your ability to be impartial given your family history, the senator said. I looked him directly in the eye. Senator, my family history taught me exactly what impartiality requires. It requires looking at the evidence, not the narratives people create. It requires honoring truth over convenience. My grandparents showed me what real family values look like: loyalty, presence, sacrifice. My biological parents showed me the opposite. That lawsuit wasn't about money. It was about protecting the wishes of a man who deserved respect. If you think that makes me unsuitable to be a judge, then we have very different definitions of justice. The gallery erupted in applause. The senator moved on to other questions. I was confirmed by a wide margin. My first day on the bench, I wore my grandfather's judicial robe. My grandmother had saved it after he retired, and it still smelled faintly of his cologne. It was too big on me, but I didn't care. I felt him there with me, guiding my decisions, steadying my hand. My first case was a custody dispute between divorcing parents. Both sides had hired expensive lawyers who turned the courtroom into a battlefield. The child at the center of it all, a 9-year-old girl named Emma, sat in the gallery with her court-appointed advocate, looking small and scared. I listened to both attorneys present their cases, watched them tear each other down, saw how little they actually focused on what was best for Emma. When they finally finished, I asked to speak with Emma in my chambers. She sat in the big chair across from my desk, her feet not quite reaching the floor. Emma, I said gently, I'm not going to ask you to choose between your parents. That's not fair to you. But I am going to ask you what you need to feel safe and loved. She looked at me with eyes that reminded me of my own childhood. Eyes that had seen too much conflict, too much selfishness disguised as love. I just want them to stop fighting, she whispered. I want them to remember that I'm there. I made my ruling that afternoon. Joint custody with strict provisions, both parents were required to attend co-parenting counseling. Neither parent was permitted to speak negatively about the other in Emma's presence. All communication about Emma had to go through a parenting coordinator. And most importantly, Emma's schedule was to be respected above all else, with severe consequences for any parent who used her as a weapon in their conflict. This child deserves parents who put her needs above their own anger, I said from the bench. She deserves adults who remember that she's watching, that she's learning, that she will remember how you treat her and each other. Make sure what she remembers is love, not war. Both attorneys looked stunned. Both parents looked chastened. Emma's advocate smiled. News of my ruling spread quickly. I became known as a judge who didn't tolerate games, who saw through manufactured narratives to the truth underneath. Some attorneys loved me. Others hated me. I didn't care about either response. I cared about getting it right. 5 years into my time on the bench, Scott called my chambers. My assistant put him through before realizing who he was. Haley, his voice came through the phone, rough and uncertain. It's Scott. It's Scott Morrison. I said nothing, waiting. Diane is sick, he said. Heart disease. It's bad. She wants to see you. No, I said simply. She's your mother, he protested. She had 33 years to build a relationship with me, I replied. She chose not to. I'm not going to pretend those choices don't matter now that she's facing consequences. She might die, Scott said, his voice rising. Then she'll die the way she lived, I said. Without me. Don't call again. I hung up. 2 weeks later, my assistant handed me a death notice. Diane Morrison dead at 53 from complications of heart disease. Services to be held at a funeral home in Connecticut. I felt nothing. No grief, no regret, no sense of loss. She had been a stranger in life. Her death didn't change that. I didn't attend the funeral. I sent no flowers, no card, no acknowledgement of any kind. Some of my colleagues thought I was being cruel. Judge Thompson understood. You don't owe her your grief, he said when I told him. You don't owe her anything. I know, I said. I just wanted to make sure I actually felt that way. And I do. Years passed. I rose through the judicial ranks, known for my fairness and my unwillingness to tolerate bullshit. When I was 41, I was appointed to the state Supreme Court, the youngest justice in decades. I took my oath of office with my hand on my grandfather's old Bible, feeling the weight of his legacy and my own responsibility to uphold it. My first major opinion was in a case involving grandparents' rights. The parents had cut off all contact between their children and the maternal grandparents after a dispute. The grandparents sued for visitation rights. I wrote the majority opinion upholding the parents' decision. Not because I thought the grandparents were wrong, but because the law was clear parents had the fundamental right to make decisions about their children's upbringing, including who had access to them. But I included a concurring section that wasn't legally necessary but felt important. This court recognizes that family relationships are complex, and that biology alone does not create a bond worthy of protection. The law must respect parental authority, but we must also acknowledge a simple truth. Children, remember who was there for them. They remember who showed up, who loved them, who chose them every single day. Legal rights cannot compel love, and court orders cannot manufacture presence. The adults in these disputes would do well to remember that the children are watching, learning, and forming memories that will last a lifetime. Make sure those memories are worth creating. The opinion was controversial. Some legal scholars praised it for its humanity. Others criticized it as judicial overreach. I didn't care. My grandfather had taught me that sometimes the most important things you say from the bench aren't legally binding. They're morally necessary. Scott died when I was 45 alone in a cheap apartment after years of failed businesses and mounting debts. A lawyer contacted me about his estate, such as it was. He had left everything to me with a note, "I'm sorry. I wish I had been better." I donated his meager possessions to charity without looking at them. The note I kept, not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder. A reminder that regret at the end doesn't erase absence in the middle. That sorry means nothing without changed behavior. That you can't wait until someone is successful to decide they're worth your time. 10 years after my grandfather's death, I was invited to give the commencement speech at the law school named in his honor. I stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of young faces, and I told them the truth. My grandfather left me everything when he died, I began. Not because I manipulated him, though my biological parents claimed that in court. Not because I was his only heir, though that's what the will said. He left me everything because I was there. I was there for Sunday dinners when I could have been out with friends. I was there for doctor's appointments when he got older. I was there on the anniversary of my grandmother's death when he needed someone to remember her with him. I was there consistently and completely for 32 years. I paused, letting that sink in. Your legal education will teach you how to argue, how to research, how to write. But I want to teach you something more fundamental. Show up. Show up for your clients, your colleagues, your family. Show up when it's convenient and when it's not. Show up when you're tired, when you're busy, when you'd rather be anywhere else. Because success isn't just about brilliance or ambition. It's about presence. It's about being there consistently and completely, especially when it's hard. The graduates gave me a standing ovation. Afterward, dozens of them lined up to shake my hand and tell me their own stories of family of loss, of people who had showed up for them when others hadn't. I listened to every single story. I showed up for them the way my grandfather had shown up for me. 20 years after his death, the state Supreme Court building was renamed the William Parker Justice Center. The ceremony was elaborate with speeches from governors and senators and legal luminaries. But when it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. William Parker could have refused when his teenage daughter left a baby on his doorstep, I said. He could have insisted it wasn't his responsibility, that he had already raised his child. Instead, he showed up. Every single day for 32 years, he showed up. He taught me that family isn't about who shares your DNA. It's about who shares your life, who sits with you through loss, who celebrates your victories, who loves you not because they have to, but because they choose to. I looked up at the portrait of my grandfather that would hang in the building's main lobby. They had captured his expression perfectly: wise, compassionate, uncompromising. People ask me if I'm bitter about my childhood, I continued. I'm not. Because being raised by William and Helen Parker was the greatest gift I ever received. They showed me what real love looks like. They showed me that presence is more valuable than presence. They showed me that showing up is the most important thing you can do. I touched the portrait gently. We did it, Grandpa. Everything you hoped for, everything you believed I could become. I hope I made you proud. The crowd erupted in applause, but I barely heard it. All I could hear was my grandfather's voice in my memory telling me on my 18th birthday, "You're going to do extraordinary things, Haley Bear. Not because of who you came from, but because of who you are." He had been right. I retired at 60 after 3 decades on the bench. I had made my mark on the law-shaped precedents that would last long after I was gone, but more importantly, I had lived with integrity. I had honored the people who had honored me. I had used every gift they had given me, every lesson they had taught me to make the world slightly more just. In my final opinion before retirement, a case about inheritance rights, I wrote one last statement that summarized everything I had learned. The law cannot measure love. It cannot weigh devotion or quantify sacrifice. It can only look at evidence and make determinations based on facts, but perhaps that's enough. Perhaps when we look honestly at who was present and who was absent, who gave and who took, who loved and who merely said they loved, the law can approach something like justice. Not perfect justice, but real justice. The kind that honors truth over convenience, presence over promises, action over words. It was my final word from the bench, and I meant every syllable. Now at 62, I live in the house my grandfather left me. I've redecorated it slightly, making it my own, but his study remains untouched. His books still line the shelves. His chess set still sits on the side table. His portrait hangs above the fireplace. Sometimes I sit in his chair and talk to him, telling him about my day, about the law, about the world. I know he's not really there, not in any physical sense, but his principles are there. His love is there. His presence, cultivated over 32 years of showing up, is there. That's the thing about people who truly love you. They never really leave. They become the voice in your head that tells you to do the right thing. They become the strength you draw on when things get hard. They become the love you pass forward to others who need it. Diane and Scott are footnotes in my story. They were the biological beginning, but they were never the narrative. My grandparents were the story. Their love, their sacrifice, their unwavering presence, that's what shaped me. That's what made me who I am. I won. Not just the lawsuit, though. That victory was sweet. I won the bigger battle. I won the war against bitterness and resentment. I won the fight to become someone my grandparents could be proud of. I won the right to live a life of purpose and integrity. And they lost. Not just the money, though. That loss was fitting. They lost the opportunity to know me. They lost the chance to be part of something bigger than themselves. They lost 32 years of memories, of connection, of love. They lost the most valuable thing anyone can have: a family that chooses them every single day. I sit by the window now, looking out at the garden where I still plant tulips every fall. In my hand is a photograph, me, my grandfather, and my grandmother at my 8th birthday party. Our faces are smeared with chocolate cake, and we're laughing so hard our eyes are squeezed shut. This is my inheritance. Not the money, though I use that well. Not the house, though I love it. This moment frozen in time, this proof that I was loved completely and unconditionally by people who chose me every single day. This is what I carry with me. This is what Diane and Scott can never take away because they never gave it to begin with. They thought family was about blood and obligation. My grandparents taught me it's about presence and choice. They thought love was something you could fake for an inheritance. My grandparents taught me it's something you build one day at a time over decades. I was right that day in the courtroom when I told Diane she was just a stranger. I was right to walk away. I was right to refuse to let them rewrite history or claim credit they hadn't earned. And I was right to spend every possible moment with my grandparents while they were alive, because now they're gone, and what I have left are memories so rich and beautiful. They sustain me through every difficult moment. That's the verdict. Blood-delivered biology means nothing without presence. DNA means nothing without devotion. Being a parent is a verb, not a noun. It's something you do every single day, or you're not really doing it at all. My grandparents did it perfectly. Diane and Scott didn't do it at all. And the law in its wisdom recognized the difference. That's the whole truth. The only truth that matters.